Oh, great. We are recording. Let me start the timer. So welcome, everybody. The event title is Hidden in Plain Sight, the history of slavery and mainline faith communities. I'm so glad that you all could join us today. My name is Colin McCrossan. I'm a graduate student, as Reverend Kavanagh said, in the history department at Villanova University, where I work for the Rooted Project, which is Villanova's 3-year initiative to study its connections to slavery, segregation, and gender discrimination. What is the group? Let's just start with what is the Community Breakfast Collaborative. It is a nonprofit organization that is a anti-racist nonprofit located in the main line that works to realize Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of creating a beloved community in America. And the group does this through civic action, interfaith educational events, prayer, and dialogue. We host an annual anti-racist Unlearning Racism Annual Breakfast Day in September, which we'll get to at the end of the presentation. Who am I? I'm Colin McCrossan. We just went over that. Grad student. Why am I researching this? This is a part of the research that I'm doing for Villanova, but it has also broadened to the surrounding area. Villanova, of course, is not isolated in the community. Why I wanted to make it an interfaith group is because, one, the Community Breakfast Collaborative is an interfaith organization, and because we can learn from other religions, other faith practices and traditions, and work to create more understanding between religious beliefs in this area and throughout our world, our shared community. The goal of this event is to learn about the history of slavery in the main line, and then in the second half of the event to talk about it with each other. Here's the group's board of directors. We have Ann Minicozy, who's right up here. This is Sean Chambers. This is Diana Robertson, Chuck Marshall, Reverend Kavanagh, who had spoke, Gitti Etemad, who's on the Zoom, and Susan Underwood. So that's the group. Here's our event outline. We just had the welcome. I'm in the middle of the presentation. At 3:45-ish, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll distribute everybody who still wants to participate in the event into breakout rooms. In those breakout rooms, we're going to talk with each other about this history, what we've learned, and what we think we should do now, if anything. Then we'll come back to the main room and have like a brief conclusion. So here are the faith groups that I'm going to be talking about today who are in the main line area, which I'm kind of defining as broadly Delaware County, Montgomery County, Chester County, outside of Philadelphia. So I'm going to talk about these groups, how they're connected to the history of slavery. I'm working with kind of a case study approach to analyze one group's traditions and history to learn about slavery overall. Throughout the presentation, what I'm going to do, and what I want to try to ask you to do too, is think about the enslaved people's perspectives as we walk through the different histories of these groups. The history of slavery is very disturbing. It's emotional because it's so horrible. So I want to also put a content warning that the history is disturbing. Here's the main kind of points of the presentation, the main argument. Slavery is a part of mainline faith groups' histories through 3 different ways. Mainline faith groups had historic leaders who were slave owners. They had members who were slave owners, or they might be located near or on spaces where Black people were enslaved by white people in the main line. Second part is that enslaved people and slave owners had diverse religious beliefs. And the third part is that slavery is our community's history. It's a part of our history, our shared history together in this area. So the first 3 groups that I'm going to talk about are Radnor, Old Haverford, and Mary and Friends meetings, which are Quaker meetings in the main line. Historic members of these meetings were slave owners. Now, a lot of Quaker meetings in the Philadelphia area had slave owners amongst their ranks. I'm just focusing on these 3 because they're in the main line. Quakers and slavery, there's a long history of about over 100 years of people debating about slavery, slavers being involved, and Quakers being involved in the slave trade. So that's kind of the context. There's a long history that we can't go into. But that being said, by 1774, these debates about slavery within Quaker leadership had led to the Quaker leaders in Philadelphia saying, we need to convince fellow Quakers who were slave owners in our meetings, this is in the 1770s, to free the people that they enslaved, to stop enslaving Black people. So the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the leadership of the Quakers in the United States at the time, decided that each local meeting would create committees to send to slave owners who were in the Quaker meetings to convince them to free their slaves. In 1776, in September, the leadership made a kind of ultimatum that said, if these slave owners in the meetings don't disown, don't free the people they enslaved, they won't be Quakers officially anymore. How do we know this? How do we know that Quakers were slave owners, that these debates were going on? Well, the Quakers were really excellent record keepers. And what we're looking at on the left is a screenshot of the meeting minutes from the Quakers when they're discussing all of this history. So that's how we know that they were slave owners and these debates were going on. The three groups we're going to talk about today are Radnor Meeting, which is up here in the left-hand corner, which is in Radnor, Marion Meeting, which is over in Narberth, and Old Haverford Friends Meeting, which is in Havertown. So something came up my Zoom, click out of that, move this over here. So how did this process work? The Quakers said, if you're a slave owner, you have to free the people that you're enslaving. And they said that we're going to form committees. So what they did, they created committees over here on the left. Then they met with slave owners in their meetings. They went to their houses. And this part in the middle here is kind of the negotiation process of working with the slave owners, trying to convince them that this is wrong, that holding fellow human beings in bondage was against their religious beliefs. Some people just flat out criticized the committee and said, no, I'm not going to. They were disowned from the meeting and they continued enslaving. Other people they continued to work with, and they secured manumissions of the people that were enslaved. The slaves who were, the Black people who were being enslaved by these Quakers were either immediately freed or they had kind of a delayed version of freedom. And we'll get to that in a minute. So that's kind of this process that we're working with here. So my PowerPoint, okay, there we go. So the process of these meetings with these slave owners from the Quaker committees, what could they have been like? This is one example from the Haverford monthly meeting, which Radnor, Marion, and Old Haverford meetings were all a part of, this monthly kind of structure, this business meeting. This is one example of a farmer named John Lewis from Haverford who enslaved these two Black people named Caesar and Phyllis. So this kind of gives us a sense, this diagram of all of the different characters and actors involved in this process. What could it have been like specifically for Caesar and Phyllis for these committees to come to John Lewis's house and try to talk to him about these people that they're enslaving when they're also there? These first meetings took place from May to November of 1776. What I want to highlight too is that these Quakers had, very complicated religious beliefs, but as did Caesar and Phyllis, though we don't know exactly what they were from the Quaker minutes alone. A lot of slave owners in the Quaker meetings refused to free the people that they enslaved. These are some of the tactics that they used. They justified the practice. They criticized the committee. They would ask the committee for more time. They draw it out. What we're looking at here on the right is an example from the meeting minutes of a slave owner named John Morgan. And the committee is writing that he has purchased a slave, a Negro boy, quote, that he holds, and he pretends to be against slavery, but he won't free the boy. And so they're still talking to him. John Morgan did eventually free the boy he enslaved, whose name was George. We know this because Quakers produced manumission documents. These are legal documents that recorded someone's freedom, that said, I insert slave owner name here, I'm freeing this person on this date. It's kind of boilerplate language. But a lot of the slave owners delayed the freedom of these people to still, be able to exploit and enslave them until they reached a certain age. So he's saying that George, he'll still be enslaving George until he turns 28 years old, which will be in March 1787. This is from Haverford College's archives. They have a great new site all about these manumission documents. These are all of the slave owners in these meetings who complied with the committee's requests. Unfortunately, out of the three meetings, we have Haverford, Radnor, and Marion. The meeting minutes, remember that slide with that kind of microfilm image, doesn't tell us which meeting exactly these people were a part of. It just says in general, these are the ones that were in the monthly meeting, that overarching structure. These are the names of all of the enslaved Black people who were freed immediately or gradually. Usually the gradual emancipation, these people would finally become free, supposedly at the age of 21. Here are all the slave owners who refused to comply within these meetings. They were disowned and they continued enslaving Black people. These first four are all a part of this Havard family in Tredyffrin, which is a really interesting example. So we have the Quakers, and we have Quakers who are slave owners. John Morgan, who we just talked about, he is connected to St. Thomas of Villanova and Villanova University. How? If he's a Quaker, he didn't, Villanova started in the 19th century. The church and the university are located on what was part of the Morgan's family land. So this is a space of enslavement where John Morgan was enslaving George and two other Black people. Morgan inherited some of the people that he enslaved from his father, Samuel. Samuel, John, and Magdalene Morgan, this family of white slave owners who were a part of the Quaker meetings, enslaved three Black people named Chloe, Jack, and George. How do we know? So this is building, the point of this section is to say Quakers are also connected to this Catholic church at Villanova through the shared history from this Morgan family example. How do we know that they were slave owners? Well, they kept records too. This is a slave bill of sale document, a legal document recording the sale of one human being from another. This is from a woman named Hannah Harrison, who lived on a tobacco plantation, which is now the Harriton House Historic Site in Bryn Mawr, so right nearby. She sold Jack, this enslaved boy, to Samuel Morgan for the sum of 29 pounds, current lawful money of Pennsylvania. This is in 1759, or 1749, excuse me. Jack, a few years later, freed himself from John Morgan's enslavement and ran away. Morgan, in response, posted this fugitive slave advertisement, which were advertisements designed to recapture enslaved people who had freed themselves. They provide a lot of details about enslaved people that otherwise are lost and not recorded in the historical record. Morgan says that he ran away from him on September 24th. His name is Jack. He was wearing this clothing, and that whoever takes him up again shall receive 30 shillings reward paid by him. 3 years later, it's likely that the Morgans had recaptured Jack because John's mother, Magdalene, the woman we talked about earlier, posts this slave sale advertisement for a man that pretty much matches Jack's description. He's the same age. He's born in this country. He can farm. If you want to buy him, go to Magdalene Morgan or ask of her in Radnor. We know that Villanova is located on the part of the Morgans' land from deed records. This is one deed where the Morgans sold the land to a tavern keeper named Jonathan Miller in 1801. In 1790, John Morgan still was enslaving one person, though. So going back to the manumission record for George, he told the Quaker meeting that 1787 he'll be free. So, but who's this person? This enslaved person from the 1790 census? It's unclear. Magdalene Morgan, that person could have been Chloe, who she enslaved. This is from her will in 1798, 8 years later. And she says that she's giving money to her daughters to give to, quote, my Negro woman, Chloe, to kind of give to her. It's unclear if she's enslaved at this point. Is she free? We don't know from the will alone. This is just a timeline of this history we're talking about in Villanova to draw out this history. Eventually, the Morgan's land, as we can see in 1842-ish, part of the Morgan's land is sold to the Augustinians who founded Villanova in 1842. And I'll make this PowerPoint available to everybody, just so you can have the images too. Near Villanova, right near Villanova, only a few miles away, is St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne. Historic leaders and members of St. David's were also slave owners. A historic leader of the church, Reverend William Curie, was a slave owner. He enslaved 6 Black people, Glasgow, Quaco, Deb, Moll, and Moll's 2 children. And a historic member of the church, General Anthony Wayne, who many people might be familiar with, enslaved a Black man named Toby. This is a picture of the old kind of church. There's a newer church across the street. We know that William Curie, the leader of the church, enslaved people because he advertised for their sale in a newspaper. Here in, let me get the date, move this zoom. In 1754, he's advertising for the people we just talked about, Glasgow and Quaco. He's about 21, Quaco's about 36. Likewise, 2 enslaved women, Negro wenches. It's a very offensive term to hypersexualize Black women used in slavery. And also an indentured servant who he says he's been here for 7 years. If you want to buy these people or buy the rest of this indentured servant's time, you got to talk to William Curie. We also know that he was a slave owner from tax assessments for Chester County. Here he is. It's unclear what the date of this is. It's sometime in between the 1760s and 1780s. He's enslaving 1 Negro man and 1 Negro wench, end quote, who are worth less than 100 acres of land and his house. Here's his grave in the church, in the cemetery. William Curie, he's right here. That grave is over here. What I want to focus on with him is, where are these enslaved people buried? What were their religious beliefs like? The Episcopal Church in America didn't start until the late 1780s. At this point, Curie was a minister of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. In Philadelphia, we know a lot. We don't know a ton, but we know a lot about enslaved and free Black people who were married in places like Christ Church, which is now an Episcopal church. We know some of their religious beliefs, but out in the main line, out in the areas surrounding the city, there's really just so little research done. We don't know yet about people like Moll, Deb, Glasgow, and Quaco. Anthony, Wayne, and Toby, who were historic members of the church, lived and were forced to live at the Wayne Estate, which is called historic Waynesboro today. It's across from a golf course. It's right off of Route 30, a little bit south. We know that Anthony Wayne enslaved Toby from a slave register from 1780, when the Pennsylvania passed the first gradual abolition law in the country that did not end slavery immediately, but that said that every child born to an enslaved mother after the passage of the date of the law would no longer be enslaved, but they would have a period of indentured service or term slavery until they reached a certain age. So all of the slave owners, if they wanted to be in compliance with this new law, registered the people they enslaved with the county in which they lived. So that's what we're looking at here, this slave register. A little bit further east, I know I'm moving fast here with all these groups, is Bethel AME Church of Ardmore, which is located on a space of enslavement. What do I mean by space of enslavement? The land that Bethel sits on was the historic property of a slave-owning family named the Humphreys, a white family, 3 siblings, Charles, Elizabeth, and Rebecca. They enslaved 9 people: Caesar Waters, Judy Miller, Thomas Crail, Dolly, Tommy, Alice, Fanny, Nanny, and Nancy. How do we know? How do we know that Bethel sits on this land? Well, we can use historic maps. So I'm also talking about the sources that we use as historians to uncover this history. This is a historic mapping project from the University of Pennsylvania. It provides a ton of helpful maps from 1777. Here's a part of Charles Humphrey's land as registered in the map. So this is kind of near Haverford College. This is his land. This is where Bethel AME is located. So we know that it's on Charles Humphrey's property from the map, this space of enslavement. It's not a specific site, but this general area that he owned. We know that he enslaved these people because he also registered them along with his sister Elizabeth and the estate of his sister Rebecca in the same slave register, which looks like this. Elizabeth and Rebecca, going back to how some of these groups are interconnected, were Quakers. So when the monthly meetings were forming these committees to convince slave owners, they actually went to Elizabeth and Rebecca, and they were disowned. They would not free the people that they enslaved. Here's a quote from the meeting minutes. Elizabeth and Rebecca Humphreys, they're holding people still in bondage. They refuse to release them. So they have separated themselves from us. This is what it looks like on the left in the microfilm. And they were disowned in December of 1779. Rebecca died shortly afterwards. So that's how Bethel is connected to some of these Quaker meetings through the historic property, but also the historic faith connection. Then we have Zion Baptist Church of Ardmore, which is located right near the Humphreys property. So it's located in this right near this space of enslavement. So you might be thinking, oh, well, how could they really be even connected? Because they didn't have historic leaders or members who were slave owners. They weren't even located on Humphrey's land. What historians have said, though, is that enslaved people and slave owners did not stay in one place their whole lives. They were moving throughout this area and throughout this space. What we know about Zion Baptist is that it's located right near Humphrey's land. Enslaved people did not just stay in the confines of Humphrey's property. Judy Miller was not just only living from Ardmore Avenue to Grandview Road. She was moving throughout this space. So that's how the church is still connected to this history, through the shared locational history. Here's Bethel AME, the second marker. Then here we have Old Haverford Friends and their cemetery. Why I bring this up is because Charles Humphreys, when he died in 1786, he was buried in the Quaker meeting. So we're talking about the Quakers, Bethel AME, Zion Baptist Church, spatial history, enslaved people, slave owners moving around, how it's connected. This is his grave. In his will, he freed some of the people that he enslaved. He freed Caesar, Tom, and Judy. Gradually, he said only this would take place 6 months after his death. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're looking at his will, his original will. I've transcribed some of the parts of it onto the right. He gave Tom, Caesar, and Judy land that he owned in Radnor Township, land that they had likely worked and increased the value of. Why I bring this up is because Caesar Waters married a woman named Phoebe, lived on this land after he was enslaved by Charles Humphreys, and they were visited by Richard Allen, who helped to found and is the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So we're just talking about Bethel AME, which is an AME church. Caesar and Phoebe Waters were visited by Allen, and Allen wrote about them in his autobiography, which I have a selection of printed here. He said he had little money. He was preaching around in the area. He stopped at Caesar Waters. They were really kind to him. They helped him out. They washed his feet. They prayed with him. He did a service the next day. He said that he had never been more kindly received by strangers than by them. So that's how do we know that's this land? We know from deed records. We know from his will. We know from the historic map, which I'll get to in the next slide. So all of these churches are connected historically and contemporaneously. Bethel AME Church is a part of the AME church community. Caesar and Phoebe Waters were enslaved by Charles Humphreys, who was a Quaker, whose sisters were just owned by those other meetings. This is the space. It's now a park today, Bishop Richard Allen Park in Radnor, right before you get to Bryn Mawr Hospital, if you're familiar with the area. Here are these locations today. This is the land that I was just talking about. Here's where our Zion Baptist of Ardmore is, and Bethel AME Ardmore. Here's Old Haverford Friends in the meeting and the grave site. And remember too, in the 18th century, township borders, people's property lines, county lines, these things were not, as they are today, set in stone and impermeable boundaries. People are moving around. They're going from one place to another. They might own property in one town, but they worship in another. Okay, breathe. The next church that I'm going to talk about, Middletown Presbyterian Church. It's out in Media. So not really historically what people think of as the main line, but we're talking about this area, this community. This is our shared community's history. Historic leaders, the historic leader of the church and a historic member were slave owners. How do we know? We'll get to the sources. The leader, Reverend James Anderson, enslaved 4 Black people, a man named Caesar, also named Jacob Holy, a name he gave himself. We'll get to that. A woman named Dinah, and 2 other Black people named George and Joe, who he enslaved as children, and then who he was still enslaving when they were much older. Here's a picture of Middletown Presbyterian Church out in Media. How do we know that Anderson was a slave owner, this historic leader? Well, remember we were talking about a fugitive slave advertisement in the beginning of the presentation. One of the people that Anderson enslaved, Caesar, freed himself with another enslaved person when Anderson was living in Springfield Township, which is in Delaware County. How do we know? Because Anderson and the other slave owner, James Crozer, posted a fugitive slave ad to get both of these guys back. And if that's not, like too much information for you. The ad is remarkable. They say in the ad, it's kind of like, joint written, I guess, that they ran away from these subscribers. Caesar is 18. He had this clothing on. The other guy is named Anthony Welsh, commonly called Tone. They are very careful in combing their wool, meaning taking care of their hair, possibly practicing an African cultural tradition. Probably, not possible. And it is likely they thought they're going towards the camp with a design to enlist, but it is hoped they will not meet with the Dunmore there. What that means is during the Revolutionary War, which this is taking place in, the British said to enslaved people, if you flee to the British lines, we will free you. So run away from your American slave-owning masters and come join us. Now, the history is much more complicated on what actually happened, but these two slave owners thought that Caesar and Anthony Welsh were headed towards the British. These guys aren't waiting around to be freed or talking about freedom. No, they're taking it into their own hands. We know that Anderson or someone else recaptured Caesar because 3 years later, in that same register we're talking about, he records him along with these three other people as being enslaved. So we don't know how exactly he's recaptured or how long he was freed, but we know he was because he appears in this register as his property 3 years later. But Caesar's not done. This guy's pretty bold. 7 years after that, he runs away again, and Dinah ran away. They both freed themselves. Here's the original advertisement on the left, and I've transcribed it on the right. James Anderson, he says he's now living in Middletown. And Caesar, this guy who he enslaves, he describes him. He says he's very proud. He pretends to much religion and can converse well on the subject. So this guy's got his own religious beliefs. He took with him some hats. There's a great reason to believe he's in Philly. Likewise, ran away from me about a year ago, the woman I'm enslaving named Dinah, a year ago. So she's been free for at least a year and a half. She speaks very broken English, which historians say is likely meaning she was not born in North America, possibly Africa or the Caribbean. English is not her first language. She's been seen in Philly. She passes for a free woman, even though she's my slave, Anderson is saying. And she's in the market selling pepper pot soup. So she's got her own business. She's like, pretty entrepreneurial. Here's a map, thinking conceptually and spatially about these escapes. Here's where Middletown is out here. Somehow these people got to Philly. These are really dangerous journeys to free yourself. It's extremely dangerous. Here's an artistic representation of a Black woman selling pepper pot soup, which became a really staple food in Philadelphia, in enslaved and free Black communities and white communities as well. It's a product of cultural practices being forced together by slavery, but also Black people continuing to practice their own. Anderson is obsessed with getting Caesar back. He posts another ad, and this one is where we know about his other name. He says that Caesar, some of his associates having formed a pass for him. Remember, slave owners required the people that they enslaved, whenever they left the property, to carry a pass that said their owners allowing them to do so. He has changed his name and calls himself Jacob Holy. Wow, okay. To this pass is annexed the subscriber's name, so Anderson, and another guy who's a lawyer. So apparently he's carrying around this forged pass that says Anderson's letting him go around, according to Anderson. Clothing cannot be described well. He probably is going to purchase his own because he sold mine that he took. He's 25 years old, which matches the other advertisement. He can read, remarkable. He's a great professor of religion and has much to say on the subject. I'm sure he did. This slave-owning pastor is preaching to the congregation at Middletown Presbyterian, but Jacob Holy and these enslaved people had their own religious beliefs. They didn't, they're not like one-dimensional, mindless people. These are three-dimensional human beings with a range of emotions and beliefs. And Caesar, so much so, is like, I'm Jacob Holy. I know religion too. Here's where Anderson is buried. This is his grave. Again, thinking about graves, memorials, burials, religious practices, things that were denied to enslaved people. Where could they be buried? Are they buried in Middletown Cemetery? Are they buried somewhere else? Did Jacob Holy, where did he die? When he died, Anderson was still a slave owner. How do we know? Well, let's look at his estate inventory that was made with Delaware County. 1793, he died. Remember, we just saw that on the grave. Checks that, so that checks out. Here is all his property. Here's Joe. Remember 1780, the register, he's registering an enslaved boy named Joe. Well, Joseph is now a grown adult who is worth 50 pounds. So I want to take a moment again to really pause and think about this, the levels of dehumanization of slavery. We have Anderson's library of books, probably including copies of the Bible, which were worth $11. So Joseph is worth 5 libraries of books equivalent. Remember Anthony Welsh, the guy that Caesar ran away with originally? Well, he's got a story too, and a little bit of religious history that we can kind of piece together if he's the same guy. Here's James Anderson. Crozier, the guy who authored the Advertisement with Anderson. In 1780, he enslaved him, Anthony Walsh, who says that he remains a servant until 31 years, so he's not a slave for life. Another woman named Amelia. If this is the same Anthony Welsh, it seems like he became a member of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Here is a record of some of their baptisms. Here we have William. He's being baptized on August 27, 1799, son of Anthony and Fanny Welsh. Is this the same couple? It could be. This baptism doesn't say so, but piecing together all the contextual information, it seems likely that it is, but we don't know for sure 100%. Broomall, we're going to move to Broomall a little bit. Congregation Beth El Ner Tamid is a synagogue, a Jewish community in Broomall. It's located, I think, possibly near the historic home of a slave owner. So we have these varying connections. There are leaders who are slave owners. There are members who are slave owners, and faith communities are still located in these spaces near these places where Black people were enslaved. Dr. Bernard Van Leer was a slave owner in Marple Township. He enslaved 3 Black people, a Black woman whose name we don't know, a Black man named Charles, and a Black boy named George. Here's the congregation. It's on Paxton Hollow Road. Here is what could be what local historians say is the historic home of the Van Leer family, which looks like this. The house, according to historic resource survey forms made by the state of Pennsylvania, says that the house dates to the 18th century. Local historians say that the Van Leers lived here. Here's a copy of his will, Van Leer's will, and he describes his house in Marple Township, but it's unconfirmed if this is the exact same house of the same guy. We know that he's a slave owner from tax assessments. Here he's enslaving 1 Negro man and woman, and they mentioned that he's a doctor of physic. He also registered George, this enslaved boy who's 15 years old, a teenager, in the 1780 register, like these other slave owners. We also know about this guy, Charles, because of an enslaved girl named Kate, who ran away from her enslaver in Tredyffrin Township. That enslaver named John Wilson mentions Charles and says that Kate ran away with her. It is supposed she went off with a Black man named Charles, Wilson writes, in 1790, who served his time with Dr. Van Leer, probably the same doctor, and stole and took with him some clothing. Whoever secures her and brings her back to me shall have $4 reward. Here's Van Leer's grave. Remember, he's a member of Middletown Presbyterian Church. So the point of this example is to say that we don't know exactly if Congregation Beth El Ner Tamid is located on Van Leer's historic property, which was over 100 acres, because we can't confirm 120% that this house was the Van Leers. But we have all of this other evidence that's telling us, the historic resource forms, the state of Pennsylvania, local historians' knowledge, that's telling us that, hey, the Van Leers lived in this house that's still located in Marple. Regardless, what I want to posit and say in this event is that even if it's not, this congregation is still located in Marple, and these people were still enslaved in Marple Township. So they're still a part of the community, the area's history, and they're connected to Middletown Presbyterian Church. So there are possible interfaith connections that can be made between synagogues, between churches, between other faith groups to share this history and to look at it together and say, let's talk about it. Let's have an event. Let's get to know each other. The last example I'm going to talk about is St. James United Church of Christ, which is located in Havertown. It's located on the historic property of the Grange Estate, which is a historic home in Haverford Township. Local people might be familiar with it. The Grange Estate, we know, was a site of enslavement. It has a very long history of slavery. All of the owners from the 1720s to 1800 were slave owners. I'm going to focus on one guy, Charles Cruikshanks, who owned the property. He enslaved 3 Black men. We know because he was taxed on them. Here are his tax assessments from Chester County. Here we can see his property. He has 100 acres. He has 5 horses, 14 cattle, 40 sheep, and 3 Negroes, quote unquote. We only know their genders because another tax assessment says that they're men. So the nature of these sources is that we don't really know about these men's personal lives, their names, their origins, their thoughts in the world, their lives, the universe, their religious beliefs. We can use contextual knowledge to say that enslaved people still had their own religious beliefs. We know from some of the other advertisements. We might not know these men, but we know that Jacob Holy, who's also called Caesar, had his own. We know that they were moving around. We know that they're connected to different groups. But we don't know this example for sure because of this source, because of the nature of how this source was created. It was only created to record these men as pieces of Cruikshank's property, not as human beings. How do we know that that this church is located on the Grange's property? Well, we know that the original property of the Grange estate was over 300 acres. So we're talking about like 50 acres, some of these places, 100 acres with the Van Leers we just talked about. The Grange is massive compared to that. It goes into Lower Merion. This is, again, those same historic map project. Here's the Grange over here. So we know that this part of the Grange would have been a part of the property too, even though it's not highlighted in the map, because here's where the actual mansion house was. And here's where we know the outer lying perimeter of the property was. Here's what the Grange looks like, the historic home today. That is it for this part of the presentation. I know I kind of flew by, so I apologize if people are kind of like, what just happened? What is he talking about? Really, the goal was just to kind of introduce this history to the audience. What we're going to do now is take like a 5-minute break, get some water, use the bathroom, turn your camera off, get up and stretch, think about what is he talking about? When we come back, we're going to be in breakout groups and we're going to just get to know each other and talk about this history. We have some questions, which I'll put up on the screen again, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. So I'll set the timer for like 5 minutes. Reverend Cabanis, I'm not seeing her in the Zoom. Oh, there she is. She's going to help me with the breakout groups. So let's take a break, 4 or 5 minutes. We'll come back at 3:50. Janet, your question, the connection between the synagogue and slavery is that the synagogue is located on or near a space of enslavement. So none of the historic members of the synagogue were slave owners, but where the synagogue is located spatially is located where Black people were enslaved. Okay, so that's kind of a more indirect connection versus some of the Quaker meetings who their historic members were slave owners. The point of the synagogue was to bring up that there are also connections we can make between where places are located and where we know that people were enslaved. This community, our community, there are different spaces of enslavement, and we know that these Black people would have been enslaved and moving around in this space. And the Van Leer historic property is located right near the synagogue. We can't confirm if it's right on where this guy's property was, but that's how it's connected. So yeah, let's take a break. I'm going to mute myself and then we'll come back. Hi, Kevin. I'm just seeing you now.
How you doing, Colin?
I'm good. I hope you're hanging in.
Always. I gotta have a conversation with you soon.
Colin, it was awesome, was wonderful.
Thank you, Kitty.
It was my second time, but this one was a little different, and I truly learned a few more things. It was wonderful.
I'm glad. Yeah, thanks. This has a lot of new research too that
Yeah, it looks like it. I think the interfaith connection was very interesting.
Very interesting.
So I'm going to project the discussion questions. Obviously, you all can talk about whatever you want in the groups. We're going to put people in. Let me share my screen. These are our discussion questions. Just basic introductions. Who are you? Are you a part of a faith group? That's obviously not a requirement. This is not an event that's put on by any certain denomination. Second question part is, what's something that you learned? If anything, hopefully something. Did anything surprise you? Maybe not. The third part is, how do you think we can address the history of slavery in this area? What should we do now, if anything? Now that we know about this history, is there anything we should do? What are your ideas? Or maybe you don't think we should do anything. Maybe you think we should have this, I'm from this church and we want to talk to this one, or we want to learn more about this. So those are our kind of questions. Reverend, do we want to put people in breakout groups?
Yes, we're ready. So we're going to have 12 breakout rooms, which will have about 5 to 6 participants. So please be on the lookout for an invitation. Should be happening now. You can just accept the invitation. Alrighty, and we will come back. Colin, what time? We will come back at 4:15. So you'll have about 25 minutes for your breakouts. Alrighty, and if you need any help, just feel free to
The thing is, there's not a lot I can do about it. The truckers usually find a way to take care of this kind of stuff on their own. While EJ waits for his next look.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope that everybody had good discussions. Before we go into the back to the Zoom here. These are upcoming events we have with the Community Breakfast Collaborative. I just want to point those before we conclude. Wednesday, April 27th. So this month at 7 p.m. The location, we're still working that up, but stay tuned on the website. And if you're on our mailing list, we have the info in the next slide. It's a dialogue event about art making, creating art as a community. It's a follow-up event from a few other events we've had this year. Save the date for Wednesday, September 21st. It's our annual Undoing Racism Day. It's tentatively in person at Villanova. We don't know, things change all the time with the pandemic. So it could be moved to virtual, but hopefully we'll be having that in person. Here is our website, the communitybreakfast.weebly.com, and that's our email. We also have my email that did I ever share my screen? I'm sorry.
I was about to direct Colin.
Sorry, everybody.
No worries. There you go. And I'll put it in the chat as well. All good.
Here are our events that I was just talking about. Wednesday, April 27th. Wednesday, September 21st. And here is our website and the email. And I also put my email in the chat. And I'll put that again. So that concludes the presentation and the breakout rooms. Now the period's just kind of a question and answer. If people have questions, if they want to share about anything that they talked about that they felt really passionately about, or so we'll just open it up and I can kind of field. Let me put my email in the chat again.
You can feel free to raise your hand, or if you just want to place something in the chat, if there are any reflections, or I hear someone's voice.
Candace, I think that's.
Yes, we had started a discussion that we didn't get to end, but I am just confused. My husband is Black, and I'm just confused about, excuse me, how I'm confused about how if a Black person in a mainly white church, how they can make some headway if they feel the power lies on the side of the white people. That confuses me about what can be done today in churches specifically, and it's going to happen in synagogues too. Because I just had a great niece. The last place I was actually a member of formally was Beth David, a synagogue. Ben, I have a great niece who is half Caribbean Black, half Jamaican Black, or half Jamaican and half white. Let's put it like that. She just had a wonderful bat mitzvah. She knows Hebrew back and forward. There's going to be more and more kids like that. And out in Hawaii, all the Jewish kids in my grandson's Hebrew school are Asian, or part Asian at least. And I'm just wondering how does that's an easier situation than when you're a minority and you're like just one of a few Black people in a white church.
Well, thank you for sharing, Candace. The question was just general for everybody.
Yeah.
And so, certainly I didn't want to single out your husband and help make him be responsible for an entire church community.
No.
Pretty much what I was saying was like, what do we do with this history? We're learning about it. We can talk about it. There's renewed resistance to talking about it from a lot of people, a lot of white people in America. This is important history. It's connected to our community. Should we have events like this more often? Should we have plaques? Should there be discussions? Should we have governments involved? Should we change curriculums? Should we do nothing? I don't think we should, but should one church meet with another and meet over food? As I said in the breakout room I was in, church's history is a part of the church organization, but it's about the religious practice. You know, people don't go to church just to hear a lecture about history, but to go to for spiritual and faith reasons, primarily, I would think. So that's kind of the point of the question. I had struggled to come up with discussion questions. What should people talk about? Should they just get to know each other? Should it just end like that? I think we should do something more. I don't know what it is. There are many
Well,
ideas.
Art is a good way of communicating. An art exhibit, a black and white art exhibit is a good way of communicating. But I'll let somebody else talk.
This is Mary Stillings. I think we should ask the younger generation. I don't know how old everybody is in this discussion, but I'm 77, and I have a great granddaughter and grandchildren who would like to know more. I think we should ask them. And another question that we discussed in our group is, where are the slaves buried, and if it's anything happening about it?
Mhm.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's great. I think young people, I can't speak for all young people, but I think there's some growing interest. It's really difficult to say because there are really few records. I know of one enslaved person who was buried at a location near Old Haverford Friends, the Quaker meeting. Her name was Rachel. She was enslaved by one of the members there. The only record that talks about her burial is on a slave bill of sale for the purchases of her. So the record that actually records her burial was never designed to actually do that as its primary purpose. It's just kind of this marginal note that's pretty remarkable that says she's buried near the meeting. I don't know if that means in the cemetery. I don't know if that means literally outside the meeting somewhere. Could it be in the parking lot? The landscape of the 18th century has obviously changed dramatically in so many ways. So to even recover the space of where this one Black person named Rachel is buried, how would we go about that? I have no idea. There is a project going on called Sacred Spaces, I believe, and people who are more familiar with it, correct me. There's an archaeologist.
I'm just wanted to add Valley Quaker meeting. There's a person there that has lists of slaves and where they're buried. And the lady gave a talk about it many years ago. I wish somewheres I have some of the materials, but I don't know where. But a very informed list and person who has quite a bit of information. Is this talk going to be recorded? I would love to hear the beginning. I'd love to hear your beginning again. Is it?
Hi, Marge.
Hi.
Yeah, it is. We're recording now. So the first part was recorded. Thank you for adding that information. So to answer Mary, to go back to your question, there's still more research to be done. There is still more to learn. There is still more searching to do in these records. They are buried. These people are buried somewhere. Where in the main line, we don't know, but hopefully we can learn more in the future. Joyce Mosley.
There are two African-American cemeteries within like 20 minutes of Villanova. One is in near the Ballakidwood Middle School, and it has buried people since the 1800s.
Right.
And then there's Eden Cemetery in Collindale, and it is the cemetery that's the depositor of other cemeteries. So all of the African-American churches buried there when they widened roads or dug up cemeteries to put piping in, they reinterred those people at Eden.
Thank you, Joyce, for adding that. Thanks.
Hi, Colin, can you hear me?
Hi, Avis.
Hi, Avis Wanda McClinton, Quaker. I have a leading to find the enslaved people that were held in bondage by the Religious Society of Friends in the Philadelphia yearly meeting area. That's Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, I think a little bit of Maryland. Well, it is an ongoing thing happening. And I found that to the lady that asked a question, I've had a few memorial services for the enslaved people that were held in bondage by Quakers at the meeting houses. Right now, we're working on one in North Carolina. They have a old plantation, and we found the enslaved burial grounds. Philadelphia have all of them around. Arch Street Meeting House, they needed a parking lot, so they used their enslaved graveyard and put a parking lot on top of them.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
That was the parking, the burial ground at Arch Street was a burial ground for everybody for many, many years. And William Penn gave that land for a burial ground. And many, many people besides Quakers were buried there. And the last went out, it was stopped and closed because about 5,000 yellow fever people were buried there. And then they decided to put after a long discussion, the Arch Street Meeting House, which is built on top of that.
Thanks, Marge.
Burial ground.
If just make sure to raise your hand. Thanks, Avis, for that. I just want to get to Joseph. He's been raising his for a little bit, and then we can come back.
One thing, Colin,
Mm-hmm.
Morgan, you just did that white privilege and talked over me. That's why we can't get our history out. What I was saying was important to me, and you just cut me out. But that's all right. Colin, this is your presentation. Go ahead.
I have a question, but I grew up near the cemetery, near the Balkinwood Middle School. We, as kids, used to be fascinated by the fact that there were Chinese burials there and incense would be burned on the graves. But we knew it was a Black and Chinese cemetery. And James Blaine, who is Black, who was the composer of Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, is buried there. But my question is, does anyone know where the 200 slaves who were at Harriton in Bryn Mawr are buried? Harriton was the largest tobacco growing plantation north of the Mason-Dixon line in terms of the number of slaves it had before the Civil War, over 200. Someone should find out about that.
Thanks,
Maybe
Joseph.
you know about that.
Harriton is undergoing a new reinterpretation. There's new energy to re-examine its history of slavery. There is a private Harriton cemetery on the property where enslaved people could have been buried. So there's definitely spaces on the property that hopefully will be the subject of further research. Thank you for sharing about the Balkinwood Cemetery, but Harriton, we're also unsure actually about how many people were enslaved there. The records are kind of, as we're going through the new research to re-examine the really long history of slavery at Harriton and Black history in Bryn Mawr. So thanks for bringing that up, because it's a really good point about the ongoing research and one of the historic homes in the area. Diana?
Hi, Colin. One of the things that, a couple of different things that our group brought out was that, number one of the things that stated is that in learning about this history, it gives a foundation as to why we have so many issues now. Because what the history has done is simply perpetuated, manifested in the same types of systemic racism that exists today. So understanding that foundation gives the impetus for what we're still dealing with. But the other piece of that was brought out was that some of the things that can be done to at least acknowledge some of the history for where we can is having different historical markers on different locations that's actually telling briefly, that particular history, so the area, if we're talking about an area where, enslaved people were buried, have that, have the what the land might be now and what it was, and starting to install historical markers, because what that does to people who might not be interested in knowing the history, it's still letting everybody know and marking, what took place. So we thought that was very important. And then one person in our group talked about having things as far as a school a field trip. So if you start having the markers in certain areas, it could actually be something that's incorporated as a field trip for schools to visit these areas, and then have that information, such as you presented, told to why these markers are important and why they exist.
Yeah, thank you, Diana, for sharing those great ideas. Last question, Peggy, or comment?
Yeah, hi, Colin. I think the original query of this last part was, how do we as faith communities move ahead with correcting, reimagining a way for us to understand and grow in the knowledge of what happened and what the reparations are. My meeting, Quakers have a thing where they worship share and they thresh. And my meeting is starting this with regard to racism. I think all faith communities, not just Quakers, should begin this kind of dialogue within their congregations. And then when we get to a place in our threshing and sharing where we come up with a crystallized couple of ideas of how to proceed, we could then, as a wider faith community, share this. Yeah, the time is well past sticking this under the rug. And when was it, who was just talking? Who was talking? Diane was talking about plaques and things. Yes, our dear Lucretia Mott, who was a rabble rouser for equality. All the homes she ever lived in are gone. Where she got married, the meeting house where she got married downtown, is gone. There is a plaque on the last place she lived, which is, oh golly, I can't remember right now, but in Germantown, they did put a beautiful stone over her very modest grave, so that you can go and see that somewhere, at some point, people said, we have to celebrate this woman. This woman took great risks. So that, yeah, these are the people who are going to push us ahead. These are the people who we have to remember when we're trying to grow our own knowledge about this.
Thanks so much, Peggy. And thank you everyone for coming. We're going to end here today. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me. We will work to make sure that everybody gets a PowerPoint and the event details, so you don't have to request it from me through the email that we use. So stay tuned for that. That'll be kind of a little bit. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Reverend, for hosting. Thank you all of the board members. Everybody stay safe. Kevin, did you want to?
Let me unmute. Yeah. I want to say something real quick, because I already texted Reverend Cavanis. Right now, we are collaborating on having a Juneteenth festival coming up in I believe on the 18th in Ardmore and the 11th in Mount Pleasant at Miss Maisie Hall Park. And so just wanted to get that shameless plug in. but it also ties in, and Colin, that's why I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because part of our conversation was, the fact that the Juneteenth, how did it really affect anything over here on the main line? Because we always, hear about it being in Texas mostly, but I'm sure it's been, it's been across the country. So anyway, just wanted to put that out there, and hopefully we can get some more information out.
Yeah, that's great. And Kevin is also 2 groups to plug for him: the Radnor Civic Township Civic Association. I think I have that name right. And Mainline Mentoring is his group that he runs. So feel free to Google those two. They have events. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everybody. Stay safe. Thanks for coming again.
Yep. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Colin.
Colin.
Take care,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so very
Thank
much.
you.
It was great. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye, Teddy. Bye.
Bye, Colin. I'll be in touch.
Okay, cool.